1776, written by David McCullough and winner of the Pulitzer Prize. McCullough's thesis incorporated both aspects of the American inferiority in preparation and the British confidence. The thesis is, despite obvious American inferiority in preparation and soldiers, the British's overconfidence and sense of superiority caused devastating mistakes, eventually causing the defeat of the unbeatable empire. The detailed research and evidence incorporated into the book leads one to believe that the targeted audience is other historians. The attention to detail of the appearances of the people is impeccable. References to other, lesser-known historical facts are also prominent. However, there is enough basic information contained in the book 1776 that the average person would be able to both read and understand the novel. In the months leading up to 1776, tensions were extremely prominent between the British and the Americans. Despite King George III's reputation as an accepting, unpretentious person, especially for a king, he began to feel large amounts of disdain to the Americans. He viewed them as taking his generosity for granted, and to a certain extent, he was correct. They had gotten away with so much more than they would have had if they had been in Britain. They became dependent on an immature conclusion that they deserved to be able to do anything they wanted for the sole purpose of being Americans. King George became so fed up with the constant rebellions, protests, and entitlement in America that on the 26th of October, 1775, His Royal Majesty, King George III, declared America as in rebellion. Many people agreed with his statement, but others did not. No matter what, all the people of Britain knew that the destruction caused by the angry colonists in America must be stopped. To attempt to control the violent outbursts in America, the king sent reinforcements to Boston, which was widely regarded as the center of all the madness started by the Americans in protest of the British actions. The declaration of war was soon followed by an almost equally important declaration of a new secretary for the colonies, the menacing, in-control Lord George Germain. He would later play an enormous role in the Revolutionary War as a whole. Despite all the bravado of the American colonies, they were in a crisis. Their armies were made up of untrained men, mostly farmers. Instead of the troops being in top condition, they were sickly, with little food, fresh water, even clothes to go around. Weapons were not top of the line. Instead, the militia brought anything that they owned that could be used as a weapon. Despite the risks and inferiority of the troops, the Americans possessed hope for the freedom of their country and confidence that they would achieve it. The leaders of the Continental Army consisted of the skilled but inexperienced Nathanael Greene and the famed George Washington. They together possessed little experience, despite Washington's participation in the earlier French and Indian War. Greene was very young at the start of the war and possessed a limp that made others underestimate his skill. He was a Quaker, later dismissed by the religion for his high military position and passion for fighting. He was largely self-educated, but made up for his shortcomings with unparalleled strategy and understanding of the art of war, despite his previous inexperience. Washington, on the other hand, was well into his 40s when the Revolution started. As a veteran of the French and Indian War, he possessed some expertise of the wars in general. However, Washington's command during the previous war was largely unsuccessful. His popularity is undeniable, however, and many people today regard his appointment as commander of the American Army as a political move rather than a logical one. The British Army, on the other hand, enlisted the extremely successful General William Howe as commander. They had crisp, clean uniforms, new guns with bayonets, trained soldiers, basically everything the Americans did not have. There is no lack of salary and, at first, no lack of food. Nevertheless, as the year progressed, their overconfidence came into play. While the British were distracted, Henry Knox crept into Quebec to steal the supplies of war from the French colony. The Americans planned to attack the city of Boston, where the British army was residing. The British rejected the information regarding the planned siege. They did not think that the unorganized, poor American army would be capable of attacking a city such as Boston, facing the King's army, or even planning such a feat. They were, of course, wrong. Howe's wartime expertise stemmed from his participation in the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War as the Europeans call it. His participation was extremely prominent in the Battle of Bunker's Hill in 1775, and his presence permeated throughout the rest of the Revolutionary War as a whole. Despite the 1775 American loss at the Battle of Bunker Hill, the British lost a huge amount of soldiers, resulting in reinforcements being sent to the colonies, in particular to Boston. After the resulting siege of Boston, the one that the British ignored the warnings of, the location of the war moved from Boston, now abandoned, to New York City. Before the siege of the city, supplies began to run extremely dry in Boston, and even firewood was hard to find. When found, all supplies were hugely expensive. No supplies were coming into the previously bustling city. It was almost a good thing for the people of Boston when the bombardment of the city began on the 5th of March, 1776. Not so much for the British. Despite their returning 2-hour-long bombardment, the opposing army was far too elevated for the British to hit them. The resulting evacuation of Boston was shocking. The city had never been so empty. It was devoid of all citizens, all soldiers, and almost all life. Many of the people leaving Boston would never see the city again. Both armies moved to New York City, with the British fleeing Boston to the unprotected city and the Americans mobilizing to stop the invasion. Despite success in driving the English from the port city of Boston, the Americans were not so successful in New York. In fact, both the American and British armies had trouble with the terrain around the city, as well as the climate for the entirety of their stay in the city. However, in New York, the British had the advantage. The Americans knew nothing of the location or plans of the British, unlike when they were planning the siege of Boston. The British had the added advantage of 17,000 Hessian soldiers. On the 21st of August, 1776, there was a huge storm, killing many American soldiers, in the process lowering morale and feelings of confidence in the troops. The very next day, on the 22nd of August, the British attacked. Though the battle did not actually begin that day, the Americans knew of the approaching danger. A few days later, when the British opened fire on the American soldiers, they massacred the troops. The Battle of Brooklyn had been a bloodbath, and Washington had shown his ineptitude in it. The Americans knew that they would have to retreat, and the issue was brought up over if they should burn the city of New York. The Congress said not to, so an official order was never given. However, a mysterious fire later started, turning much of the city to ash. The loss of New York weighed heavily on Washington. Soldiers were abandoning, faking illness, turning traitor, really anything to get out of the army. They were losing confidence in both Washington and in the cause for which they were fighting. Other people were actually sick, and the lack of food and warm clothes was getting to the soldiers. They were falling ill very quickly. Washington had almost lost hope when he saw the opportunity to strike. He ordered his troops to cross the frozen Delaware River at night on Christmas Day, 1776, while the Hessians at the town they were to attack celebrated Christmas. The Americans attacked early on the 26th of December, and the town, Trenton, fell under fire. The Hessians were unprepared, and their resistance was quickly smashed. Out of 1,000 Hessians, almost all were captured. The others who weren't captured were either seriously wounded or dead, but the Americans had only lost 5 soldiers. Though the war lasted for more than 6 years after the Battle of Trenton, the American morale was restored, and hope again became prominent in the American people.
Yankee Doodle went to town riding on a pony. He stuck a feather in his hat and called it macaroni. Yankee